Life in a foreign land. Culture shock and adaptation. When someone thinks of a missionary, the first image that comes to mind may be a dedicated individual preaching the gospel to a crowd in a distant land or serving meals to those in need in a remote village. While these acts of service are indeed a part of missionary life, what often goes unnoticed are the internal battles that come with adapting to a new culture. The real challenge of missionary work begins long before a word is spoken or a sermon is preached. It starts with understanding and living in a foreign land, where everything from the language to the customs can feel unfamiliar and overwhelming. In this chapter, we will explore the experience of culture shock and adaptation every missionary faces. The names and situations you will encounter here are fictional, but the lessons are real. Culture shock is not just an obstacle to overcome, it is a process that can deepen your understanding of yourself, your faith, and the people you are called to serve. The initial shock. A world turned upside down. When Ethan arrived in Southeast Asia for his first missionary assignment, the air was thick with humidity, and the sounds of the bustling city were unlike anything he had ever experienced. He had spent the last few months preparing for this moment, reading up on the local culture, learning a few key phrases in the local language, and mentally preparing himself for the adventure ahead, but nothing could have truly prepared him for the reality of stepping into a world so different from his own. On his first morning, Ethan walked through the narrow streets of his new home, taking in the sights and sounds. The vibrant colors of the market stalls, the smell of unfamiliar spices, and the cacophony of voices speaking a language he barely understood all overwhelmed his senses. The excitement he had felt just a day before quickly turned into anxiety. Everything felt foreign, and he realized how alone he was in this new place for the first time. Ethan's first few weeks in the country were marked by confusion and frustration. Simple tasks like buying groceries or asking for directions became monumental challenges. He would often find himself lost in translation, struggling to communicate with locals who were patient but confused by his efforts. At night, he would return to his slight apartment feeling drained, wondering if he had made a mistake. This initial stage of culture shock is typical for most missionaries. The sense of displacement can be overwhelming as the familiar rhythms of life are replaced with new customs, foods, and social norms. It is not just the language that feels foreign, it is how people interact, the expectations of hospitality, and even the unspoken rules of behavior. For Ethan, adjusting to these changes was more difficult than anticipated. Navigating language barriers. A lesson in humility. One of the biggest challenges for missionaries serving in a foreign land is learning the language. Language is not just a tool for communication, it is a gateway to understanding the heart and soul of a culture. Without it, you are an outsider looking in, unable to engage fully with the people you are there to serve. Ethan knew learning the language was essential to his mission, but the process was slow and often frustrating. He enrolled in a language school, spending hours each day practicing basic phrases and grammar rules. But no matter how hard he tried, he struggled to keep up. The locals spoke quickly, using idioms and slang that did not appear in his textbooks. He constantly made mistakes, embarrassing himself in front of shopkeepers and taxi drivers. One afternoon, after a particularly frustrating attempt to order lunch, Ethan sat down with a local pastor who had become his mentor. The pastor smiled kindly and said, "Learning the language takes time, my friend. It is not just about speaking the words but about learning to think and feel in a new way. You are not just translating English into their language, you are learning to see the world through their eyes." This conversation was a turning point for Ethan. He realized that learning the language was not just a task to complete, it was a spiritual journey. Each mistake was an opportunity for humility, and each new word learned was a step closer to understanding the people he was there to serve. Over time, as he began to grasp the language more fully, he noticed a shift in his interactions with the locals. The more effort he put into speaking their language, the more they welcomed him into their community. Building relationships, the heart of cross-cultural ministry. Language is just one part of the equation. For missionaries, building meaningful relationships with the local community is at the core of their work. However, building trust in a foreign culture takes time and effort. It requires not only understanding the language but also learning the customs, respecting the cultural norms, and showing a genuine interest in the people's lives. For Ethan, building relationships was a slow process. In his home country, friendships were formed quickly, often through shared interests or mutual connections. However, in Southeast Asia, relationships were built differently. Hospitality had a deep value, and trust had to be earned over time. Ethan found that his role as a missionary was not just about preaching or teaching. It was about showing up, being present, and living life alongside the people in his community. He spent hours sitting in the homes of local families, sharing meals, and listening to their stories. At first, it felt awkward. He was not used to the slower pace of life or the way conversations seemed to linger over cups of tea. But as time passed, he began to appreciate the depth of connection from simply being with people. One of Ethan's most significant relationships was with a local man named Arun, who ran a small shop near his apartment. At first, their interactions were brief and transactional. Ethan would buy supplies, and Arun would hand him his change with a polite nod. However, their relationship deepened as Ethan's language skills improved, and he tried to converse with Arun. Arun invited Ethan to his home for dinner one evening, marking a turning point in their friendship. As they sat together, sharing a meal, Arun began to open up about his life, struggles, and curiosity about the faith that had brought Ethan to his country. Ethan saw the power of relational ministry in these moments of quiet conversation over shared food and laughter. It was not about grand gestures or significant events but building trust, one interaction at a time. The spiritual lessons of adaptation. Adjusting to life in a foreign culture is not just about learning new customs or mastering a language, it is a profoundly spiritual process. For missionaries like Ethan, adapting to a new culture is an exercise in humility, patience, and dependence on God. It is about letting go of preconceived notions and being open to how God works in and through the local culture. One of the greatest spiritual lessons Ethan learned during his time in Southeast Asia was the importance of surrender. As a foreigner, he had come up with his ideas of what mission work should look like. He had plans and strategies for reaching the community and sharing the gospel. But as he spent more time in the culture, he realized that God was already at work long before he arrived. In 1 Corinthians 9:19-23, NIV, the Apostle Paul writes about his approach to ministry in different cultural contexts. Though I am free and belong to no one, I have made myself a slave to everyone, to win as many as possible. To the Jews I became like a Jew, to win the Jews. To those under the law I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so as to win those under the law. To those not having the law I became like one not having the law, though I am not free from God's law but am under Christ's law, so as to win those not having the law. To the weak I became weak, to win the weak. I have become all things to all people so that by all possible means I might save some. Paul's words resonated deeply with Ethan. He understood that he had to adapt to the culture he served to be effective in his mission. He could not impose his way of doing things. He had to become like one of them, learning from the people, respecting their traditions, and finding common ground. This process of adaptation was challenging but also deeply rewarding. As Ethan let go of his need to control the outcomes and trusted God to lead him, he began to see fruit in his ministry. People were not just hearing his words, they were seeing his life. His willingness to learn, adapt, and serve without expectation opened doors for deeper conversations about faith. Overcoming homesickness and finding a new home. One of the often unspoken challenges of missionary life is homesickness. Being far from family and friends and the familiar comforts of home can weigh heavily on missionaries, especially during the early months of their assignment. For Ethan, the first few months were the hardest. He missed his hometown's familiar sights and sounds, the comfort of speaking his language, and the closeness of his friends and family. However, as time passed, Ethan realized that home was not just a place, it was the people around him. The foreign land that had once felt so distant began to feel like home. The relationships he had built with the local community, the shared meals, the conversations, and the quiet moments of prayer all contributed to a sense of belonging. Ethan's experience is not unique. Many missionaries find that while they may never fully fit into the culture they serve, they can still find a sense of home in the relationships they build and the community they become a part of. The rewards of cultural adaptation. While the challenges of culture shock and adaptation are real, so are the rewards. For missionaries like Ethan, learning to live in a foreign culture is not just about survival, it is about transformation. The difficulties of adjusting to a new language, customs, and way of life shape missionaries into more compassionate, humble, and resilient people. Ethan often reflected on how much he had grown in Southeast Asia. The frustration of language learning had taught him patience, the slow process of building relationships had taught him the value of presence, and the experience of cultural adaptation had deepened his faith in ways he had not anticipated. More than anything, Ethan learned that mission work is not about doing, it is about being. It is about being present, open, and willing to learn. It is about trusting that God is at work, even when things do not go according to plan. Biblical insight. Paul's adaptability in ministry. The Apostle Paul is perhaps the most outstanding example of a missionary who understood the importance of adapting to different cultures. As Paul traveled from city to city, preaching the gospel to Jews and Gentiles alike, he adapted his message and approach to fit the cultural context of each place he visited. In 1 Corinthians 9:19-23, NIV, Paul's words reflect his deep understanding of cultural adaptation. He knew that to reach people, he had to meet them where they were, both culturally and spiritually. Paul's willingness to become all things to all people is a powerful example of the humility and flexibility required for practical missionary work. For missionaries like Ethan, Paul's example reminds them that mission success is not about imposing one's way of doing things, but about learning to serve in a way that respects and honors the local culture. Conclusion: the spiritual growth of cultural adaptation. Life in a foreign land is filled with challenges, culture shock, language barriers, homesickness, and the slow process of building trust, but it is also filled with spiritual growth. For missionaries like Ethan, adapting to a new culture is about survival and becoming more like Christ, humble, patient, and willing to serve. Through the struggles of cultural adaptation, Ethan learned some of the most valuable lessons of his life. He learned to let go of control, to trust God in the process, and to love people in a way that transcended cultural differences. For those called to serve in foreign lands, the journey of cultural adaptation is not easy, but it is worth it. The rewards of deep relationships, spiritual growth, and the joy of seeing lives transformed by the gospel make every challenge worthwhile. Ultimately, Ethan's time in Southeast Asia was not just about what he did for the people there but what God did for him, and that is the true gift of missionary life.